Well, next week will mark the 8th anniversary of the first transfer of prisoners in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. Although President Obama came into office last year promising to close down the infamous detention center, nearly 200 men are still imprisoned in Guantanamo. As the Obama administration grapples with security concerns stemming from the attempted airline bombing on Christmas, the future of these men hangs in the balance. On Tuesday, President Obama noted that the would-be bomber had received training in Yemen and emphasized his links to a Yemeni branch of al-Qaeda. He went on to announce that he had suspended the transfer of any more Guantanamo detainees to Yemen. About half of the men remaining in Guantanamo are from Yemen.
Given the unsettled situation, I've spoken to the Attorney General, and we've agreed that we will not be transferring additional detainees back to Yemen at this time. But make no mistake, we will close Guantanamo prison, which has damaged our national security interests and become a tremendous recruiting tool for al-Qaeda. In fact, that was an explicit rationale for the formation of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And as I've always said, we will do so. We will close the prison in a manner that keeps the American people safe and secure.
Meanwhile, classified Pentagon assessments show an increase in the number of prisoners released from Guantanamo who've joined militant groups like al-Qaeda. For more on the future of Guantanamo and the men still being held there, we're joined now from London by journalist and author Andy Worthington. His book is called The Guantanamo Files, The Stories of the 774 Detainees in America's Illegal Prison. He's co-director of the film Outside the Law, Stories from Guantanamo. We welcome you to Democracy Now! Explain what you understand will happen to these Yemeni prisoners, Andy.
Hi there. Well, I'm not sure what's going to happen to them. I mean, the president didn't put a time limit on how long he's going to wait before all this dies down and before he can and get some more of these men transferred back to Yemen. Because without it, clearly, it's going to be next to impossible to close the prison. And I think that's really the worrying thing about how this deadline has slipped. You know, last year in the executive order, the president announced that the prison would close by January the 22nd. He conceded 2 months ago that deadline was going to be missed. But he hasn't set a new one. How long is it going to take? How will these things just roll on forever? I think it's very hard to tell at the moment, and that's really quite disappointing.
Well, Andy Worthington, many conservative leaders have been criticizing the administration, especially for the most recent release of 6 of the prisoners. But there was not a whole lot of furor over the approximately 500 or more released under the Bush administration. Could you talk about that?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think I was absolutely shocked by the hysteria that greeted this this failed bomb plot. I mean, I don't take a bomb plot lightly, but the hysteria that greeted it was so misplaced. You know, first of all, ABC News came up with a poorly researched story suggesting that the failed bomber had met with a group in Yemen, which involved 2 prisoners, Saudi prisoners, released from Guantanamo. It turned out that one of these men had actually handed himself into the Yemeni authorities in February last year, several months before Abdul Muttalab arrived in the country, so he clearly couldn't have been involved. We're left with this one Saudi. Now, what's been mentioned but really hasn't been made much of, and particularly hasn't been made by lawmakers and other right-wing pundits who've seized on this, is that these Saudis, this Saudi and there are allegedly a few others, were released by George W. Bush. They were released after military review boards at Guantanamo, and they were released after the intelligence services had actually suggested that these men shouldn't be released because they thought that they constituted a danger. So it's part of a diplomatic deal that was done between the Bush administration and the Saudis. But it's nothing to do with the Yemeni prisoners in Guantanamo. It's nothing to do with Barack Obama, who's been very careful about who he's been releasing. You know, so I find that absolutely disgraceful, really. And we've ended up in this position where Yemeni prisoners who've been held, for the most part, for 8 years, who've been approved for transfer by the deliberations of the interagency task force established by President Obama this year, in some cases by the U.S. courts after having their habeas corpus petitions granted, are now being made the victim of this game of political football. And I'm disappointed that President Obama backed down. It's yet again another example of pragmatism which which really, I think, comes out as cowardice, because John Brennan, when he went on the TV shows at the weekend, made a very strong and credible and coherent case for what the administration was doing, how it was working with the Yemeni government regarding these transfers, how it was doing everything very carefully and wasn't making the same kind of mistakes that were made by the Bush administration.
I wanted
so,
to
you know, I think it's just another example of backing down under pressure.
Andy
Sorry,
Worthington,
Amy, go ahead.
I wanted to ask you about this piece in the New York Times yesterday that says administration officials said that a classified Pentagon report concludes that some 560 detainees transferred abroad from the military prison at Guantanamo Bay, about 1 in 5 engaged in or suspected of engaging in terrorism or militant activity. The finding comes amid reports that one former Guantanamo detainee released in 2007 under the administration of President Bush is now involved with a branch of al-Qaeda based in Yemen, a group that President Obama said sponsored the attempt to attack the airline on Christmas Day. Andy Worthington.
Well, you know, this is really quite extraordinary, I think. I mean, we have a story which is put out by a number of supposedly reputable media outlets based on a statement by a Pentagon spokesman. Not a single shred of paper was presented to any of these media outlets indicating any names, any information whatsoever. And just, you know, just back in May last year, we had another version of this story when a Pentagon report that actually included some names said that 1 in 7 of the people released from Guantanamo had returned to the battlefield. The New York Times got in trouble. They ran a front-page story spouting this information about the 74 and failing to point out that the Pentagon had actually only named 27 people. Now, when researchers who have done a lot of work on this, from the New America Foundation and from the Seton Hall Law School, their figures of the number of people who could be said possibly to have either returned to the battlefield or to have engaged in some terrorist activities in the first place was somewhere between 12 and 20, so nowhere near the 74. So what we get the other day that everybody leaps on in the media is a claim that now this figure is over 100. And yet, if we compare it with what could be factually established back in May, that would mean that we've got, what, 80 or 90 people who have rejoined the battle just in the last 6 months. It's absolutely ludicrous. You know, and the Pentagon consistently produces this kind of information at useful times. I mean, it really makes me wonder who's running the show here. Who in the Pentagon is making this kind of material available the day after Barack Obama has backed down on releasing any more Yemenis, which is clearly part of a whole story that makes it more and more difficult to close Guantanamo. Whose side are they on? Whose agenda is being set here?
Andy Worthington, you've delved into a lot of the individual stories of the prisoners at Guantanamo. Tell us about some of the Yemenis that are still being held and whose continued incarceration or freedom hangs in the balance now in the decision of the Obama administration.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, you know, by my reckoning, there are 86 Yemenis still in Guantanamo. About 22 were seized in Afghanistan, about 35 somewhere at the Pakistani border, perhaps crossing from Afghanistan, perhaps they'd actually been in Pakistan. And 25 were captured in house raids in various cities in Pakistan, far from Afghanistan. Now, you know, some of these men had traveled to Afghanistan for reasons of humanitarian aid or because they were missionaries. I mean, certainly not all by any means. You know, a lot of people had traveled there to help the Taliban fight against the Northern Alliance in an inter-Muslim civil war that had been going on long before the 9/11 attacks and essentially had nothing to do with al-Qaeda. But you also have quite a lot of these people who were seized in these house raids in Pakistan. Some had gone looking for cheap medical treatment. A number of these men were very clearly students. And some of the prisoners who'd been cleared were caught in a guest house in Pakistan. And several of these have been released. One of them won his habeas corpus petition last May. And Judge Kessler, when she made the ruling in his case, the case of this man, Ali bin Ali Ahmed, she said that there were a number of other people in this house and that from what she could tell, their stories were almost certainly the same. And this man was a student. the judge said that the government had relied on unreliable witnesses within Guantanamo who had made false allegations,